And so this morning we are studying Psalm 125. What I'm going to do is put up Psalm 125 and read it, and then I'm going to go back through it, first just with the pshat, the explaining some of the challenges of content that come with trying to translate the psalm. That will include some midrash, and then the closing two questions. When was the psalm written? Which, of course, as you'll see, is unknown. But what are the theories? And last, why and how is the psalm relevant for us? And so with that, I put up Psalm 125, and I have gone back and forth with some translation pieces. This is my current version, and I am even tempted to change the title. But for now, I will point out the following before I begin to read. And that is, there is actually a tension in this psalm. Although I choose to title it from the opening line, Never Shaken, Forever Settled, as verses 1 and 2 are about trust in God, with a metaphor of Jerusalem. And again, Psalms of Ascent, 120 to 134, are often identified with a mindset of moving toward Jerusalem. And so the opening image will be one of trust, and yet verses 3 and 5 are a prayer, a calling on God to respond to those who are leaners toward their crookedness, which is to say that there is insecurity in verses 3 to 5. And so what opens with a quality of confidence will then shift to vulnerability. With that, let me read and then go back through the psalm. A song of ascents. Those who trust in Adonai are like Mount Zion, never shaken, forever settled. Jerusalem, mountains encircle her. So Adonai encircles God's people from now until evermore. For the staff of wickedness will not rest on the lot of the just, in order that the just will not cast into iniquity their hands. Do good, Adonai, for the good, for those upright in their hearts. And the leaners toward their crookedness, Adonai will lead them away with the workers of iniquity. Shalom upon Israel. Because it's short, let me read it also in Hebrew. I enjoy the rhythms and the expressions in the original. Shir HaMa'alot, Habotchim B'Adonai Kahar Tzion, Lo Yimot La'olam Yeshev. Yerushalayim Harim Saviv Lah, V'Adonai Saviv La'amo Me'ata V'Ad Olam, Ki Lo Yanuach Shevet Heresha Al Hagoral HaTzadikim. Lama'an lo yishlechu hatzadikim ba'avlata yedehem. Heitiva Adonai latovim, veli sharim belibotam. V'hamatim hakal kalotam yolechem Adonai et polei ha'aven. Shalom al Yisrael. Well, in this case, I'm going to go from the end first, heading toward the beginning. The closing three words, Shalom al Yisrael, appear here for the first time in Psalms, but it will get repeated soon in another closing of a Psalm of Ascent. Shalom upon Israel will become a slogan. May there be peace on Israel. I shared in the introduction for the Psalm a mosaic from a synagogue in Jericho, the Byzantine period, 6th, 7th century, in which there are some key symbols of Jewish belonging, with, in the mosaic, these three words embedded: Shalom al Yisrael. I chose to keep the word shalom because it's known pretty widely in English already, and there's more nuance to the word shalom than peace. Shalom is often translated as well-being for Israel. Shalom includes well-being, includes peace, includes wholeness, and in Hebrew it has a deeper quality of completeness. That word shalem also means complete. And now for one of the, still focused on verse 5, this opening phrase, v'hamatim hakalkalotam, is unique to this moment. You get the word akalkalotam in only one other place in the Tanakh, and that's in the book of Judges 5:6, in which there'll be the phrase Yelchu arachot akalkalot, which JPS translates as, and wayfarers went by roundabout paths. The word hamatim is a distinctive word as well, and here's some different ways it gets translated. JPS, but those who in their crookedness act corruptly. King James Version, they turn aside unto their crooked ways. Adin Steinsaltz, they twist their crooked ways, which, using matim as twist, Adin Steinsaltz will add, they've not only follow crooked ways, they make such paths even more twisted than they are. So these matim hakalkalotam are a contrast with verse 4, v'lisharim belibotam. Lisharim belibotam are those who are upright, yashar, those who are straight, dependable, having integrity, belibotam, in their hearts. Betocho kivaro, the rabbis will say of a person of integrity that their inner is like their outer. And so that is the quality here. They're upright in how they act, guided by their hearts. Their hearts, their thoughts are consonant with their actions, which are straight. In that is contrasted, hamatim has the same root as mateh. A mateh is a staff. We'll have another word used here earlier for staff, and that's shevet. But a mateh is a staff. It's that on which you lean for support. The word akalkalotam in the concordance for Ibn Shoshan will define the word with another word, mifutal, which is a word that doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible, but that gets understood in modern Hebrew as meaning twisted, curved, or convoluted. So here is verses 4 and 5, somewhat the punchline. Do good, Adonai, for the good. Heitiv Adonai latovim. And then it defines who are the good. The good are the lisharim belibotam, the people of integrity, upright in their hearts, which, by the way, as I will get to it, is not necessarily purity. It's not necessarily the tzaddik who, as we might define it in other places, or it can, but it simply means they are people of integrity, upright in their hearts, and they're contrasted with the leaners toward their crookedness, who the commentaries will say is a lower level than workers of iniquity. So they will be led away, these leaners toward crookedness, with the workers of iniquity. And then the question is, as when? When will that happen? This psalm is understood particularly by the medieval commentators, Sforno, Rabbi David Kimchi, to be a prophetic psalm of a messianic era, so that at the end of days, those who are the arrogant, who are the deceitful, they are the ones who will be led away. It kind of parallels the following from the book of Zephaniah. Here is the prophet Zephaniah, whose book is very short. It's only 3 chapters. But in describing the end of days, chapter 3, verse 11, in that day, now describing the messianic future, you will no longer be shamed for all the deeds by which you have defied me. So there, God says, you will have the opportunity of repentance. For then I will remove the proud and the exultant within you, alizeh ga'avatech, and you will be haughty no more on my sacred mountain. But I will leave within you a poor humble folk, and they shall find refuge in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel shall do no wrong and speak no falsehood. A deceitful tongue shall not be in their mouths. Only such as these shall graze and lie down, with none to trouble them. And so here in Zephaniah, writing after in and around the destruction of the first temple, is again the emphasis on those who are of a deceitful tongue will be no more. And Rashi will comment on this phrase, Vahamatim hakalkalatam, that it refers to those who, quote, make wicked accusations. So I'm backing up. I'm reading it in reverse. Verse 3, for the staff of wickedness will not rest on the lot of the just. Now the word shevet, I translate as staff. Others will translate as scepter, which would imply that, because it can be a scepter, shevet also means tribe. It's an identifying staff. So it could be used in other places in the Bible as the banner of identification, often, identified with royalty. The staff of Judah will not depart in that final blessing of Jacob. But as Adin Steinsaltz will point out, who will choose to use the word rod instead of scepter for shevet in verse 3, it's not necessarily a government. It's not necessarily a political statement, which is true for those translations that use the word scepter. It can be for whoever is exerting authority, power. For the staff of wickedness will not rest on the lot of the just. And now this word goral, the lot of the just, is also kind of an interesting choice of words. In that lot, goral, that's a word that appears 77 times in Tanakh. Literally, it's a lot, like in lottery, but in Exodus, in Joshua, it's also used to be a synonym for an allotted part of land. And so for the staff of wickedness will not rest on the allotted land of the just, is another way this gets translated. What I like about the word goral is it implies a certain quality of luck, of uncertainty in life. And indeed, 2 ways this gets used in quoted 3a. The first part is sota 2a. In the Talmud, they'll say that God arranges marriages according to the goodness of each person. And then they will use this as a proof text. For the staff of wickedness will not rest on the lot of the just, meaning God will match good people with good people. That's kind of just an interesting way in which 3a is quoted in the Talmud. And in Esther Rabbah, the Midrash 7:13 on the book of Esther, this will be identified with Haman, which we saw in Psalm 124, the Ha'adam, the mortal, was identified in Midrash as Haman. That's still getting played out in this next psalm. For the staff of wickedness will not rest on the lot of the just, and they will write in that Midrash that as Haman sought to cast lots against the just, so he would be punished by that same date that was chosen, in order that the just will not cast into iniquity their hands. That in English is a little bit awkward because I try to follow the Hebrew. In order that the just will not become influenced by the wicked. Their hand will not partake in sin. So that the staff of the wicked, the power of the wicked, the identity of the wicked will not come to bear on the just, so that the just will remain just. Here is this vulnerability in verse 3, that to be among the wicked is to run the risk of being influenced by how they live, by lowering your own standards of right and wrong, by being able to justify by this is what everybody does. And so here, verses 3 to 5, the second half of the psalm, reveal a quality of vulnerability, a prayer, if you will, for God to separate the just from the wicked, to do good for the good, and to make a distinction between those of integrity, the upright in their hearts, and the leaners toward their crookedness. Vahamatim, again, those who lean on kalkalotam. I get the image in my mind of pretzels, those who are twisting their presentations. And now the contrast to the opening of the psalm. The psalm starts off with confidence and is widely, in terms of the traditional commentaries like Mitsuda and Art Scroll, when they introduce this psalm, they will say this is a psalm about trust in God's abiding protection. And it is in the first two verses. That might link. We'll now look at the first two. Those who trust in Adonai, habodchim ba'Adonai, are like Mount Zion. And again, Mount Zion can be used in two ways. Mount Zion is where today's David's citadel is. It's where King David's tomb is identified as being, or the Last Supper as well. It's a specific small mountain just to the south of Har Moriah, which is the mountain which has the temple. But at the same time, Mount Zion is used for that entire part of Jerusalem. The walled city of Jerusalem is also called Mount Zion. So just a little, pause to say Mount Zion can be used in a specific way or in a more general way. Here can be either, but the image is, as Mount Zion is probably in the broader sense, the place where God's presence is abiding. It is where the Holy of Holies was located, with the image that it is where God will always be. And that temple might have been destroyed, but God's presence is still within Mount Zion, and we still look to return to Mount Zion, rebuild the temple, be present with God's abiding presence. So here the image is, the metaphor, that as God abides on Mount Zion, those who trust in Adonai are like Mount Zion, never shaken, forever settled, and by extension, always worthy of engagement with God. Jerusalem, in the second part of this image, mountains encircle her, so Adonai encircles God's people from now until evermore. And Jerusalem is circled by mountains, and it's a source of protection. That is what made Jerusalem difficult for King David to conquer the city, because it was a fortress city in the mountains surrounded by walls. And if you're on top of mountains, you can shoot down as an archer. It's harder to scale it if you're an attacker. And yet, here is a little piece to know. It's not just mountains that protect you, it's valleys too, which is to say, the old city of Jerusalem has valleys around it, except on the north side. On the north side, there isn't really a valley, and whenever Israel has been attacked in ancient times, it was attacked from the north, which is to say that the mountains are not a full protection. There's still a quality of vulnerability, which leads, with one eye on the clock, to the question, when was this written? Some say it was written during the time, most commentators of the medieval times say it was written after the destruction of the first temple and with the return to Israel shortly thereafter or afterwards, as a statement of trust in God. Others would say it was built before the destruction of the first temple, which is 586 by the Babylonians, in the following ways. Because Jerusalem has already been destroyed. And so if you deal with it more literally, that God is always protecting Jerusalem, well, you've just experienced Jerusalem being destroyed. And those like Benjamin Siegel, the rabbi living in Jerusalem today, who writes a literary commentary of the psalm, is more identified with it being during the time and the voice of the prophet Jeremiah, who basically have a messianic promise of God's enduring protection, but not the immediate protection. And that's the second half, verses 3-5. God's protection is conditional. That's the teaching of the prophet Jeremiah, that God will protect us if we are loyal to God, but not necessarily otherwise. And that becomes a break from how some of the earlier rabbis, how some of the earlier prophets presented God's enduring presence in Israel. And so as a first temple anticipating destruction, this is a promise for the future, that even though Jerusalem as a city will be destroyed, God will always endure, identified with Jerusalem. And if you are lisharim belibotam, if you are the upright in their hearts, then God will do good for you. A closing thought to pull it together. Most of the commentators focus on the first part. And even I entitled it Never Shaken, Forever Settled, because that's the opening feel. This is a psalm of promise. If you trust in God, God will forever protect you. And yet, the second half of the psalm says, wait a minute, God, I am feeling vulnerable, and let there be peace upon Israel. When will this truly be stable peace? When will Israel indeed be at peace? And again, now hearing Zephaniah and other prophets, it will be at peace in a future time in which Israel lives with integrity. You saw in my introduction to the psalm, I wrote a little bit about extreme narcissism, which has been on my mind for a number of years for a variety of reasons. I have always in my mind this line that we chant around the Shabbat table in honor of the model woman. Chapter 31 of Mishlei, of Proverbs, verse 30. Sheker achein vehevel hayofi. Kindness can be a lie. Beauty can be fleeting. Yirat Adonai hi titalal. The one who is in awe of God, the fearful, the one who has integrity, she is the one who will be praised. I like that line because it's a reminder that sometimes people can be very charming and even act generously. But if it's not from a place of sincerity, if it is indeed, if you will, a quality of self-serving that can lead to some extremes, and this is the extreme, people who are, extremely narcissistic can be charming, can act very generously, and it's all about their own needs for affirmation and can be deceptive by a lack of integrity that leads often to bad outcomes. And so that image here, that image of the model woman, the model person, as a person of integrity, is here brought to the foreground with a phrase that is unique to Psalm 125, Vahamatim hakalkalotam, and the leaners toward their crookedness. Adonai will lead them away with the workers of iniquity. And when those who are deceivers, who are corrupt, then indeed Israel will be a nation that trusts in God, and then there will be Shalom al Yisrael. In sum, we don't know when the psalm was written. Regardless if it was before the destruction of the first temple or the return of the exiles, it is a yearning for a time that has a messianic dimension. For these last verses are messianic, that it should be only those with integrity in the land, and that thereby there will be shalom al Yisrael, shalom upon Israel. With that, as an examination of Psalm 125, I look to see if there are some of those who would make a comment or two.
I'm wondering as to verse number 3, Shelby's out running errands. Maybe the symbolism is that the staff of authority of the wicked will not rest upon the land of the just, so that when the just are work that land, they're not working toward iniquity.
So it's possible. Again, I'll pull up just so everybody can see the artistry of this 3a. For the staff of wickedness will not rest on the lot of the just. And again, the word staff here, shevet, has multiple meanings. It can either be scepter, meaning authority, or it can simply be the identity of wickedness will not rest. And here too, the word goral can be on the good fortunes of the just with a sense of luck, or it can be on the land. And the nature of poetry, one definition of poetry I heard once is that what defines the difference between poetry and prose is that poetry is, by its very nature, the art of double entendre, more than one possible meaning. And that's clearly the case here. And as you say, Alex, you can choose to read it. May the authority of wickedness, not rest on the land of the just, so that people can operate without that interference. That too is possible in how this psalm is expressed, and it could have been written at a time in which Israel had just relinquished or taken over. One of the critiques, like Benjamin, about why he believes this is not written after the destruction is because it's the Persians who give Cyrus the Great, who give the green light for the Israelites to return to the land. And why would the psalmist be referring to the Persians who have acted kindly as the authority of wickedness? So that's for him a contextual piece of why it would not have been written right after the return. Any other comments or questions? And I don't see a hand, which means we then can listen to my friend Ari Goldman for a reflection on what Psalm 125 has evoked for you or your own love of Psalms.
Hello, everyone. I'm in New York. Nice to join you virtually. If I were an outsider and I just came into this class for the first time, I'd say, what's going on here? This is all mixed up. The teacher is reading from the bottom up. Who does that? And then this language is written from right to left. I'm confused. I'm going in different directions. I'm going from bottom up. I'm going, instead of normal writing from left to right, I'm reading from right to left. And then the whole thing is circled by the mountains. So I'm a little disoriented. Luckily, I'm not an outsider. I'm an insider. I'm someone who studied the Psalms and who studied with Eli Spitz and who sees the poetry in what he does. And we don't go for the literal chronological normal way. We turn everything upside down. Hafochba v'hafochba, turn it and turn it. And as we examine it, it begins to come into light. So I don't have a lot to say about the meaning of this, but the feeling of it. And that's what I want to tell you about, the feelings that it evokes in me. Shalom al Yisrael, it takes me back to Israel, it takes me back to Jerusalem, it takes me back to those hills, to those mountains that Ellie and I walked more than 20 years ago. We were both on fellowships in Israel. You let him go from your congregation. Thank you for sharing him with the rest of the world. And my university, I teach at Columbia, they let me go from my obligations. We both found ourselves on sabbatical, and our children were good friends and are good friends. They went to school together, and Ellie and I went to school together. Even as a professor and a rabbi, we were able to find common ground and study together. When Ellie evoked Eshet Chayil, the special psalm said for women at the Shabbat table, I thought of all the Shabbat meals that we shared, and our wives are friends. So I found this psalm somewhat problematic because I like unconditional love. That's what I want. That's what I want. That's what I want to hear from my tradition. But I understand that it's not so simple, and and we have to earn our place in the world, and we have to earn our love from God. Sometimes I think we do get unconditional love, and we'll get to those psalms another time. But I come away with this feeling of warmth and of possibilities. It just seems like so many possibilities when you take the psalm and you turn it upside down and you read it backwards and forwards and you circle it with the mountains. It gives me possibilities and a challenge. If I was told, everything's going to be okay, God loves you, don't do anything, just sit there, I might get lazy. But I've got to struggle a little bit. So I appreciate the struggle, and I appreciate the words of Torah from my friend. And I appreciate this community that he's gathered together. And I just spotted Rabbi Jack Reamer, who is a role model for me, and whose sermons I've stolen from and used in the classroom. So hi, Jack, and hello to all of you. And thank you again for allowing me to join you today.
Thank you, Ari, for your reflection. I smile to know of the privilege of indeed having walked the hills of Jerusalem with you and having studied sacred texts there with you. And as you so well describe the experience of this psalm, it's to be connected both to Jerusalem, but also the inner quality of Jerusalem in our lives, which is a seesaw between the yearning for unconditional love, that messianic future, and the recognition of the second half of the psalm that we have to keep working toward that goal. And in that regard, life is also conditional. A beautiful way of evoking what was evoked for you in Psalm 125. Thank you, my dear friend, for allowing us to honor you today.